Welcome to the latest edition of the Giants Huddle podcast, presented by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Giants. Giants wrap up their 2023 season Sunday at home against the Eagles. Second time these teams are squaring off in the span of 3 weeks after Philly won on Christmas 33-25. And to delve into storylines surrounding this game, the playoffs, offseason, and more, we're now joined by the host of the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. You can check out on social media at Ross Tucker NFL, former NFL offensive lineman who also serves as an analyst for CBS and Westwood One Sports, none other than Ross Tucker. Ross, you got Lance Medow here on Giants.com. Greatly appreciate the time. Hope all is well. How's everything on your end?
My pleasure, Lance. Good to see you. Good to talk with you. And yeah, everything's pretty good. You know, obviously, I do a decent amount of work in Philadelphia and for the Eagles, so could be going a little bit better, if I'm being honest. Has not been a good stretch for them over the last month or so. But yeah, man, Happy New Year. Excited to see how this season finishes up for everybody and then get into the playoffs.
Absolutely, and that's a big reason why I wanted you on the podcast. And let's start with the Eagles, because I'm curious your perspective, Ross, about their approach to this game. We heard from Nick Sirianni earlier in the week throw out that they could rest some of their starters. Now, we know the Dallas game at Washington is going to be going up simultaneously to the Eagles and the Giants game, and Dallas controls its own destiny. The Eagles need the Cowboys to lose. As a former player, what do you think the best approach for the Eagles is? Do you look at the scoreboard? Does that determine how you navigate this game? Or do you say, hey, we've lost 4 of our last 5. We need to start clicking heading into the postseason?
Right. So I think first and foremost, you play all your starters. You start all your starters because you really only look stupid, in my opinion, if, you know, for some reason the Commanders are up in the third quarter on the Cowboys and Jalen Hurts is standing on the sideline in street clothes. That would not be a good look, right? Like that would be no good. And you would be second guessed forever, and probably rightfully so, because it's just such a difference, right? And that's why the loss for the Eagles to the Arizona Cardinals was so devastating. I mean, you're talking about the potential to host 2 home playoff games as a number 2 seed versus having to go the long road of highly likely having to play 3 road playoff games, obviously, if you even get that far. So I think you play your guys, and I think you start them. I do think they would never admit this or say this, but I do think you probably do scoreboard watch, and you probably do consider how the game is going against the Giants, right? I mean, if the game is going really well and you have a lead and the Cowboys are looking like they're going to win the game, then maybe you pull your guys. I think the opposite of that's true too, right? If things aren't going well and the Cowboys have a lead, I think either way, maybe you get some of your guys out of there so they don't suffer an injury. But certainly with the way the last 5 games have gone for the Eagles, they really need to be feeling better about themselves, have some confidence going into the playoffs, because right now they just don't.
Well, speaking of the outlook for this Eagles team, Ross, you look at the last 3 games, they have watched comfortable halftime leads dissipate. I know they held on to beat the Giants, but the Cardinals scored 4 touchdowns. It looked like an offensive juggernaut. And we've seen a defense that has had its fair share of issues stopping the run, not getting after the quarterback as consistently as last season, the turnovers for Jalen Hurts. What went wrong this season? Why are they not as strong as what we witnessed last season as they rode all the way to the Super Bowl?
It's kind of the $1 million question, right? I mean, I'm from outside of Philadelphia, so that's the question I get pretty much every day, Lance, is, well, what happened? Because not only that, I mean, you know, we're talking about 5 weeks ago, they were 10-1. Every other NFL team had at least 3 losses. Jalen Hurts was the MVP favorite. They looked like a really solid bet to be the number 1 seed in the NFC. Most people like me on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast had them number 1 in my power rankings. I will say this, though, even at that moment, they clearly didn't feel as good of a team as they did a year ago. They have never clicked on offense as well this year as they did last year. And maybe that has to do with Shane Steichen, the former offensive coordinator, who's now in Indianapolis. You know, some people think that people spent the whole offseason coming up with better ways to try to defend this offense, and that has been part of it. The one thing that's definitely clear is that they're not as good on defense. And I never thought they would be as good on defense. First of all, they lost the defensive coordinator, and Jonathan Gannon, who's now the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals, but they clearly got worse at linebacker and safety. There's no doubt about it. And even though they brought both of their corners back, those guys are a year older. They're probably not as good as they were last year. And they lost their nickelback, Avonte Maddox, for most of the season. And even the linebackers they do have, like a Zach Cunningham, who's clearly been their best linebacker, he's been out the last few games. So it's all of those things combined. They've had a much tougher schedule this year. They went through a really tough stretch. Their D-line rotation is not as deep. You lose a guy like Javon Hargrave in free agency to the Niners. They're not as deep on the D-line. I think the extra snaps, the extra reps have worn on those guys. I think their two young Georgia D tackles, Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter, have hit a little bit of a rookie wall. I know it's year 2 for Davis, but he got hurt last year. So I think all those things are combined. They also haven't played with a lead as much this year as they did last year. But to your point, they did the last 3 games, and the defense, in particular defensive line, still wasn't able to really close it out for them.
Well, and that brings me to the Giants matchup here the second time around, because I think the Giants' takeaway from the first meeting was, well, they were with them for the majority of the second half. And these Eagles-Giants games have been fairly lopsided, really, over the last decade. But you wrote an interesting article, Ross, recently for the 33rd team. And you made the case there is no such thing as a meaningless football game. And we know the Giants are mathematically out of it. And we could talk about pride and guys trying to put good film out there. But what else do you think the Giants can take away from a game like this as they enter an offseason where they have some questions in various positions that need addressing?
Yeah, so the Giants are a little bit different because I don't know that there will be major changes on the coaching staff. I mean, there could be, but usually when you're a team that's already kind of out of it at this point, there's a lot of speculation surrounding the head coach. I don't think that that's the case with the Giants. But there's going to be changes, right? Like, you can't have this bad of a year and there not be changes. And a lot of those will have to do with the personnel. So those guys that are playing on Sunday for the Giants, they're playing to try to stay there. They're playing to try to keep that job and that roster spot for next year. And how they perform in this game will be sort of the last impression for their coaching staff and how they've played this year. And the only thing I know for sure, Lance, because I was around it a lot, unfortunately, my first 3 years in the NFL, my head coach got fired. I was like, I guess, the original coach killer. I don't know. But how you finish matters a lot, from a coaching standpoint, for the coordinators, for the players. It makes a big difference. It's kind of like your closing argument, your closing statement, if you will. So that's a big part of it for the guys. And even if there's a decent chance that they're not going to be there in New York, because maybe they are going to make a change with some of these players, you better play well enough that you get a job somewhere else. I mean, I argue at times that these games are more meaningful for a lot of the players, for the bad teams or the teams that aren't going to the playoffs, than they are for the teams that are going to the playoffs. Teams that are going to the playoffs might not make as many changes as the teams that have fallen way short. And you're looking at a Giants team that really still has some personnel challenges and some roster challenges that they're going to be looking at in the offseason. Plus, I do think, Giants fans, it's the last home game. It's the last game. It's been a disappointing year. I think it would really be nice for them to beat the Eagles. I mean, you probably know more than me. It feels like it's been a while since they've beaten the Eagles. It feels like the Eagles just kind of own the Giants. And even in a disappointing year, it's kind of like the last game of a college season where you play your rival, right? It would be nice, even in a disappointing year, to be able to beat the Eagles and kind of get that monkey off their back.
You love turf. You're good at it. So you start a turf biz. Business grows, your savings grow. Become the most celebrated name in turf. Are you ready for all that life brings?
Well, especially since they lost to this team 3 times last season, including in the playoffs, and they've now lost 11 in a row in Philadelphia. They did beat them at MetLife Stadium in recent history, but Ross, your point is well taken, as this is the Huddle brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Giants. From game day to every day, Citizens is made ready for Giants fans with insights, guidance, and solutions. Learn more at citizensbank.com. As we're talking with former NFL offensive lineman Ross Tucker, the host of the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. One of the decisions, Ross, that the Giants are going to have to make this offseason, and we don't know exactly where they're going to pick, but as it stands right now, they have the 5th overall pick. And you also wrote about quarterback injuries, which have been overwhelming this year across the NFL. They've played 3 different quarterbacks. Daniel Jones is going to be recovering from a torn ACL. I'm curious your perspective. If you're the Giants, Tommy DeVito is the only healthy QB under contract for next season. Tyrod Taylor is a free agent. How much do you have to consider about using that top 5 pick potentially on a quarterback, regardless of how you feel about Daniel Jones?
Well, I don't think it's regardless of how you feel about Daniel Jones. I think certainly they're going to bring in another quarterback one way or the other, right?
Sure.
It will be Daniel Jones, DeVito, and at least one other guy, which I think is interesting too, whether that other guy is a veteran or whether that other guy is a draft choice, because, maybe it's a guy like Joe Flacco, Lance, a guy that you think gives you a chance to win while Daniel Jones is rehabbing, or if Daniel Jones gets hurt again. Because Daniel Jones is still a young player, and with his contract, ask yourself if it makes sense to take another quarterback number 5 overall. However, the thing that concerns me about Daniel, and I'm a fan of his, by the way, I don't know if you know this, Lance, he was committed to my alma mater, Princeton, before he got a very late scholarship offer from Duke. So I'm not real happy with Duke. That would have been sweet if we had Daniel Jones for 4 years as our quarterback in the Ivy League. My concerns with Daniel are threefold, I guess. Number one is just the on-field performance, right? It was not great this year, again. And they don't have good receivers, right? They don't have great weapons around them, and the offensive line was struggling and all that stuff. But he still didn't perform as well as I thought he would, coming off of how he played the back half of the 2022 season. But then now you have a guy who maybe his best trait right now is his running ability, coming off a torn ACL. And before the torn ACL, he had neck issues again. And as a guy whose career ended with a herniated disc in my neck, I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned that he's now had multiple neck injuries in his career. So you've got a guy who the mobility is a big aspect of what makes him successful, coming off a torn ACL with 2 neck injuries in his career that have caused him to miss time. That's troubling to me. Troubling enough that if you loved one of these young players, I think you would consider it. Now, what makes this year unique is it feels like there's a lot of good quarterbacks coming out, right? Like there's a lot of, people talk at the top about Drake May and Caleb Williams, but there's other guys that, have a legitimate chance, right? Michael Penix and Bo Nix, and we'll see what happens with JJ McCarthy and some of these other guys that are going to be in the draft. My question is, I almost feel like it'd be ideal if the Giants could take, with that 5th overall pick, a real foundational player, whether that's a receiver or a Brock Bowers, is sort of the heir apparent to Darren Waller, or an offensive tackle, although I know that might not go over too well with Giants fans. I would love to see them get a foundational player and then maybe, take a stab at a quarterback in round 2, one of these guys that ends up falling that really shows some promise. Take your Drew Brees, Kirk Cousins. Heck, Lamar Jackson was the last pick of the 1st round, right? Like take that stab as your young developmental guy that might have a chance in round 2 as opposed to round 1, because of the fact that Daniel Jones still does have that guaranteed money and might end up being able to bounce back from these injuries and be your long-term answer.
I think all very good points, but as you highlighted, you do have to take into consideration the fact that Daniel's only gotten through one season fully healthy because of his injuries even before the torn ACL. So I think that's some food for thought. And Ross, I wouldn't overlook your point about an offensive lineman. Evan Neal, their right tackle, he has missed 14 games in the last two seasons. He has been hit by the injury bug this year. How much do you think they need to take into consideration depth? And the other thing that I'm curious is a second part of that question, and this was something else you wrote interestingly about for the 33rd team as a former offensive lineman, how challenging it is today to develop offensive linemen on your depth chart if you can't get them out on the field, and perhaps something that the Giants have had some issues with.
Right. And obviously it's interesting because Andrew Thomas struggled as a rookie and then he's gone on to become a really good player. And I think the hope, expectation was that Evan Neal would follow a similar path. I'm not sure that that's happened yet. I'm not sure, though, that the Giants are ready to kind of give up on Evan Neal in that regard and draft another offensive tackle that high in the top 10. Because honestly, like what happens if you do it again? You know, what happens if you draft another one in the top 10 and they also don't pan out like Neal kind of hasn't to this point so far? So that there's a lot there. You know, in terms of the development, it's hard, man. I mean, there's not as many practices as there used to be. There's not as many OTAs. There's not as many padded practices. There's not as much contact. They don't play as many snaps in the preseason game. I mean, there's anything you do in life. And Lance, you've been a broadcaster for a while, so have I. Man, I'm so much better than I used to be. You know, like I'm just more comfortable no matter what I'm doing, getting a chance to do some NFL games on CBS this year. And my confidence level is very high because I've done it a lot and I feel very comfortable with who I am as a broadcaster and what I bring to the table. And I think that a lot of these offensive linemen are not afforded that opportunity. But we have seen guys that teams have stuck with. Garrett Bowles in Denver comes to mind. Now, as a guy that was undrafted, Lance, I kind of get frustrated by it because I see these first-round picks where if I played like they played, I would have been cut yesterday. But because of how high they're drafted, they get chance after chance after chance. They get a chance to work through some of their issues and kind of come out on the other side, which is great. And it's good for those guys. I've often wondered, though, like how many mid to late round picks or undrafted guys would be able to have success, too, if a team showed that type of patience with them. They just don't get that opportunity.
You're ready for a change. Payday comes early with Citizens, so go to that retreat. New You moves to the country. Now you're raising goats and launching a lifestyle brand. Are you ready for all that life brings?
Yeah, patience is a rare term that is practiced in today's NFL. I think that's well said. Giants fans love a winner. It's why they love Citizens, named a 2022 Best Bank in the U.S. by The Banker as the official bank of the Giants and sponsor of the Huddle. Citizens is made ready for fans of Big Blue. Learn more at citizensbank.com. Speaking of movement on the offensive line, Russ, I want to transition to storylines in the postseason because I think one of the most impressive teams has been the Cleveland Browns. You brought up Joe Flacco as maybe a Giants target this offseason. Cleveland's been through four quarterbacks. They lose Nick Chubb. They lost both starting tackles in Jack Conklin and Jedrick Wills, and yet we're looking at a team that won 11 games, and who knows, may be able to go on a dangerous run, of course, depending on matchups. How did Cleveland manage to navigate issues that, I mean, even the Giants went through and had trouble keeping afloat in that department?
Well, so number one, you know, Kevin Stefanski made the hard decision to let go of his defensive coordinator after last year, and Jim Schwartz came in, and he's been fantastic, right? I think Jim Schwartz was kind of just what they needed. And in fairness, you know, they knew that they needed to get better along the defensive line, and they did that, right? Like they brought in guys like Dalvin Tomlinson, and they've been much better up front than they were last year or the last couple of years. So they've had arguably the best defense in football all year. That's a pretty darn good place to start. But to your point, I mean, they lose their star running back, their franchise quarterback, and not just their first two tackles, Lance, they lost DeJuan Jones, who was their third tackle.
Yep.
He's done for the year. So they got essentially their fourth and fifth offensive tackles out there. That usually sinks teams, right? Like you can lose one, maybe two. You lose your top three guys, you're usually playing with guys that don't really give you a chance to win the game. Bill Callahan, their offensive line coach, deserves a ton of credit for that. And then certainly bringing in Joe Flacco. And, it's a great look for the Kevin Stefanski and the Browns. I think he's the coach of the year in the NFL. I think it's a bad look, quite frankly, for the Jets, right? I mean, I don't know. What was Flacco, like 1-9 as a starter the last couple of years when he got in for the Jets? And now, he goes to Cleveland and he plays this well. Now, I'm sure Flacco, for whatever reason, is playing better, but man, you got to give Stefanski a lot of credit. I think I saw somewhere where they have 28% of their salary cap is on IR. That is just unbelievable that they're still playing this well. And I'm kind of, I'm intrigued by them. I'm kind of rooting for them. I think it'd be fun if Flacco could get them on a run. If they win that first game against the AFC South Division champ, Joe Flacco will have the NFL record for road victories for a starting quarterback. That's an amazing statistic. I mean, that's an impressive statistic. Winning road playoff games is not easy.
No, that's a phenomenal statistic under the circumstances that he wasn't even a member of the team that long ago in terms of what he's been doing in Cleveland. As a quick follow-up, though, to that, and I think you make an excellent point, they could very well beat the AFC South winner, Ross, because they've actually defeated all three of those teams that are in the mix to win the division. Can anyone challenge the Baltimore Ravens? And if there is a team, do you think it's Cleveland because they have familiarity within the division? Because right now, Ross, that Ravens team looks like a well-oiled machine based on what they did to two of the top offenses in the NFL.
Playing really, really well. And what's interesting about them is the production they've gotten in the pass rush without really having elite rushers. Right? I mean, that's why that D coordinator, Mike McDonald, deserves a ton of credit. Should get a head coaching job somewhere. Jadeveon Clowney, it's like he's found the fountain of youth down there. Their scheme is so good. Heck, we saw it with Michigan, similar scheme with what they were able to do against Alabama in the Rose Bowl. I think there's three teams that could really give the Ravens a good game. I think it's the Buffalo Bills, the way they're playing right now. And with having Josh Allen, it's still the Chiefs, man. It's still the Chiefs. And I know that they've struggled, but, let's put it this way. Ravens fans, Ravens players, they wouldn't be real happy with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid coming to town. I know they wouldn't, right? And then the last one's Flacco and the Browns. They wouldn't be afraid. They play him twice a year. They're not intimidated by him. And I know Ravens fans, that would be like torture to see Flacco come into Baltimore and throw some of those beautiful rainbows that he throws with the deep ball. They've seen it. They've seen it in January football a lot over the years.
And Cleveland already knocked off Baltimore 33-31 in a game they were trailing by double figures. So I'm with you. I think the Browns are definitely a team to watch out for because division rivals always can be damaging come playoff time. Ross, greatly appreciate the time and the insight. Before I let you go, though, I know Valentine's Day is fast approaching, and you have a website, myfrontpagestory.com, which I think maybe some people will be interested if they need a last-second gift here to plan accordingly. So the floor is yours.
I'm showing you what it looks like right now, Lance. My buddy started the company. I'm telling you, right, it's by far the best Valentine's Day gift. And I know it's maybe a little early for Valentine's Day, but didn't you just make a New Year's resolution to be more proactive in life, to get ahead of things a little bit more and not procrastinate, wait till the end? Go to myfrontpagestory.com. You literally talk to one of their writers, Lance, for 10 minutes, tell them how great your significant other is. They write this incredible story. It looks like it's on the cover of the newspaper, framed, beautiful. And now, because my buddy started the company, I've seen so many videos now when they're opening it, to be able to just say, Lance, hey, babe, I wanted something special, so I had a story written about you. Like, that just sounds awesome. I had a story, it's like you got Mitch Albom, right? Or Mike Lupica to write a story about them. And then when they actually read it and they read the quotes, like, I don't thank her enough for everything she does for me or me and the kids. They cry almost every time. It's amazing. Highly recommend it, fellas. myfrontpagestory.com, myfrontpagestory.com.
Plus, she can then remind her better half or her lesser half every time you walk by the frame on the wall. So that's not a bad thing either.
Well, no, that's the key, right? Because then you get in an argument and you just point to, and like, did you get a story written about me and how great I am?
There you go.
I can't remember because I got a story written about you and how great you are. It's incredible, dude. I love it.
Awesome. Well, Ross, always love going back and forth with you. Greatly appreciate the insight. It's the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Follow him on social media at Ross Tucker NFL. Greatly appreciate the time, Ross. Thanks so much.
No, my pleasure, Lance. Thanks so much for reaching out. It was fun.
Absolutely. As this is the latest edition of the Giants Huddle Podcast presented by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Giants. You can check it out on Giants.com, the mobile app, and your favorite podcast platforms.